Is there anything you would have done differently?
We reported a true story.
Our colleague Brian Williams is back in Kuwait City tonight after a close call in the skies over Iraq.
Controversial Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and questions about Kavanaugh's drinking in the past.
Sean Hannity, come on up, Sean Hannity.
Today, Andrew Cuomo is having a moment.
Heidi ho, I am Chris Stirewalt.
And I'm Eliana Johnson.
Welcome to Inkstained Wretches, where we break down what's going wrong and, in fact, what is going right with the American news media. Eliana Johnson, I don't know whether you know this, but it's cold. And I assume that as a Minnesotan, you and we've talked about this before, you do not love the cold. But listening to the news, and look, people talk about the weather. I'm as I approach age 50, I do find that I am a lot more interested in the weather than I was before, and I'm prepared to take back some of the things that I have said about old people and the weather. But talking about the fact that, and it's cold, but it's not cold, right? I mean, it's cold, but it's January, and the fact that it's in the 20s in January doesn't seem to me to be that much news.
No. And like every other day, my kid's school is like delayed opening because of road conditions. You know,
it's yes.
Everybody needs a little touch of Minnesota.
I'm all for, and I understand for public schools that if you have buses and you need to be a little more cautious than private schools do. And I don't want to be the guy who says, you're weak. But I believe, in talking to a friend whose children attend public schools in Montgomery County, they've delayed the whole week. They just said, it's cold. So no, we're just gonna start at 10 this week because it's cold. And I thought, that's bananas. That's just wild.
The city was on such lockdown for the inauguration. It was totally wild. I walked to freaking 1.2 miles in the cold, to get where I needed to go. So I don't want to hear anything.
I did, in fact, have to. I did a lot of cold weather walking. And my favorite part about the cold weather walking, people who were going to places like where you were going, dressing in formal attire and walking around when it's 20 degrees is challenging. And I saw a lot of folks struggling as I made my way, wended my way back. I saw a lot of people struggling with balancing the requirements of fashion. And I'll stop complaining. This is a very DC complaint. I'll stop complaining. The arbitrariness of what is closed and what is open throughout the day.
It was so ridiculous. But so I had actually brought a different pair of shoes because I knew there was just no way you're walking and you need nice shoes 1.2 miles. But then on the way out, the coat check could not find my coat.
That's it. Boo. That's
so yes. So that was amusing. But anyways, this is actually a perfect transition to.
Look at us segueing.
And by the way, it was what was amusing was there are obviously certain vehicles that are allowed to drive around in the closed off, cordoned off zone, including the president and the vice president, but all the senators, and if you're really rich and this, that, and the other. And so those folks didn't have any of these problems. Now let's talk about the Trump inauguration. And we're going to do our fashion or our style section first.
Amen.
And Chris, you had flagged a Washington Post piece from the style section. Now, we're going to bookend this episode because I had joked, is the Post style section going to cover Bezos's fiance Lauren Sanchez's boob-bearing, top that she wore in the Capitol Rotunda? So they did not cover that. However, our first piece is from the Washington Post style section. Trump inauguration puts the fashion in old-fashioned. And they write about Second Lady Usha Vance, who has suddenly blossomed into a fashion plate. who wore Reem Acra, and she also wore Oscar de la Renta. Oscar de la Renta also dressed the First Lady. And what else in here, Chris?
First let me
Melania looked kind of like a Bond villain, but that was, I guess,
she did have the Spy versus Spy, the black.
She did. Her
Black Crow
hat
from
was
Spy versus Spy.
Adam Lippes.
I like the hat. I'm pro hat. I got a lot of weird looks on television as I was just I was here for the hat. I understand it was an unconventional look, but
It was. So I liked it for an outdoors. I thought it was a little weird to be wearing indoors because you couldn't see her eyes, but it was a striking look to wear outdoors. And then I really liked her dress, and the neck of her dress was beautiful. And then Usha Vance all weekend. What I really liked about her look, she's beautiful, obviously, was that she seemed to know she was both looked great, but didn't at all come across like she was trying to compete with the more fashion forward Trump women. And I just thought I just like that. It's so appealing.
She looked good. I flagged the post piece because it's a good example of how the media and the nation writ large is wrestling with the idea of Trump triumphant, Trump restored. And 8 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about normalizing Donald Trump. People shouldn't normalize Donald Trump. And it is true that Donald Trump is in many ways abnormal, in some good ways, in some bad ways. But this time around, Oscar de la Renta and these other designers didn't say, I refuse to provide clothes for these people. They did, right? It has been made normal to do that. And this post piece was snide in many ways, but it was also what the style section does, right? It talks about the way that people dress and their appearance and what they do. And it had a point of view, but it was also complimentary where it was where the writers liked it. And I just thought the things that you remember when Science Magazine, I think it was Science Magazine, endorsed Kamala Harris.
Yes.
So in the media, there was a lot of in this present crisis kind of thinking for the past 8 years. In this present crisis, we cannot afford to do the things that we normally did. We have to act differently because of this present crisis. And the fashion coverage of Melania Trump and Usha Vance and all of that stuff is, to me, a good window into the fact that I think many in the media are now ready for this present crisis to be over.
The other interesting thing is that Oscar de la Renta and others were actually tweeting that they were proud to have dressed Usha Vance and others which would just have never have happened 4 years ago, which was it was like a stand-in or a symbol of what was happening writ large across several industries, because we also saw the tech CEOs sitting behind Trump at the inauguration, and was a sign that people who didn't want to touch this guy with a 10-foot pole 8 years ago now wanted to be seen with him, be associated with him, and ally with him to the extent possible. Just a total 180 from 4 years ago.
So Trump has a very kingly idea about executive power and a Nixonian kind of idea about what the presidency is and how the president should be treated and all of this stuff. And there is the upside to that, which is, I mean, this is maybe slim solace, but a king has a court. And what happens in a monarchy is that courtiers gather around the king and plead for his favor and plead for his eye. The courtiers, though, have their own power, which is they have, maybe I'll put it this way. If you've never had Oscar de la Renta address your wife, you don't have anything to lose from Oscar de la Renta. But if you have had Oscar de la Renta address your wife, you have something to lose now, right? Now you have something to lose. And there is it's a very top down approach to leadership, but there are bottom up consequences. And I guess it's a very long way of saying the effort to not normalize Trump 8 years ago, isolated Trump. We'll see now what the idea of Trump being embraced by these folks who previously shunned him. We'll see what effects that has on Trump and whether it diminishes the power of fringy people if Trump would rather be liked by Oscar de la Renta than Steve Bannon.
One other observation that I had watching the inauguration and the first couple days of coverage of the presidency was it's a total split screen. Like the only things that we've heard, if you turn on CNN or MSNBC or the major broadcast networks, the only thing that you've heard them talking about are the president's decision to pardon the January 6th rioters. And then on Fox, it's about his far more popular executive orders about immigration and crackdown on DEI. And it's just an interesting split screen, and it's hard to find a place where you can go and get all of the news.
Yeah, it's definitely a choose your news environment. You were talking about I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about the bishop who presided over the traditional prayer service at the National Cathedral, who was not ready to normalize.
Oh yes, so I had seen this New York Times article. They profiled this bishop, Marianne Buddy, who took the occasion of presiding over a service at the National Cathedral to lecture the president and the vice president at a service. And she said, "In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children, and Democratic and Republican and independent families, some of who fear for their lives." And the Times has a very flattering profile of her out yesterday. The bishop who pleaded with Trump. Was anyone going to say anything? Bishop Buddy locked eyes with President Trump and made a plea for mercy. And the war over spiritual authority in America was ignited anew. And this is a whole profile of her that's very sympathetic to her. And I thought it was symbolic. First of all, I thought it was inappropriate and the wrong place for politicking, something that Jews know well because politicking often happens inside synagogues that are not Orthodox. So I thought it was inappropriate, but it also jumped out at me as the left not understanding why they lost this election, which is that the things she's harping on, this gay, lesbian, transgender thing, the culture issues, their failure to understand why Trump won, which was many of these cultural issues, immigration and the cultural issues.
So Washington's National Cathedral is under the governance of the Episcopal Church in these United States. And you can find different kinds of Episcopal parishes in this nation. But as a body, as an institution, it's very progressive as a whole. And here was an opportunity for the bishop. So I don't know what this probably isn't a thing in the Jewish community, but among Christians, there are moments in the life of a church, a day where you have a baptism, a day like Easter, a big turnout holiday, the Creaster Christians who show up for Easter and Christmas Eve services, and those folks, where a preacher is going to have a different audience, including a lot of unchurched people, maybe people not familiar with that church. That is your opportunity to say, you're welcome here. This is a good place to be, and we're glad you're here. And it was sad to see the bishop say, I've got this great big stage, and what I want to tell everyone watching who isn't an Episcopalian or isn't a Christian or isn't participating, we're mad at you. We don't like you. And she went on to confirm basically all of the things that people who might not like her church think about her church. And she got a lot of coverage for it. She got a lot of attention for it. And it was the call for, and this is different people have different points of view, but her job, as I understand it, is to save people's souls, right? To bring them into a relationship with the Lord. And what she did was not in service of that and probably was harmful. And of course, I also should say the attacks and condemnations on this woman by Christians, people who say that they are Christians, was disheartening as well, right? Like, you shut up. It's like, okay. So anyway, it was a bummer.
Yeah. Up next, Chris, you flagged this Black America in a state of emergency. Civil rights leaders brace for Trump's return. And we can link that together with Al Sharpton announcing on MSNBC that he and the National Action Network will boycott any company that gets rid of DEI.
This clip was sent to me by alert listener Janice Belbeck, my sister. The state of emergency. And it is definitely a great example of the choose your news. MSNBC, we're in a state of emergency for Black America. It's a crisis. It's a crisis. It's a crisis. I don't have any reason to think a crisis is something. I believe the NAACP's magazine is called The Crisis. A crisis is not something that goes on forever. You can be very concerned about what's happening to Black Americans. You can have concerns about all that stuff. But crisis, emergency, it's an emergency is wild. And for Sharpton and company to say, we're going to take the terms of the argument as framed by our opponents and feed back into it. Jonah Goldberg, peace be upon him, wrote a great piece this week about how DEI is not new. Diversity, equity, and inclusion has gone by many names over time. People have called it affirmative action. They've called it other things, but the idea of making a priority out of diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a new idea. It's a new name. And it's a name that Trump and company have seized on. Al Sharpton says, I'm seizing the name back. And whatever we call DEI, whatever gets the title of DEI, must be retained or we will boycott you, is impossibly stupid. It's all impossibly stupid, but that is impossibly stupid.
Well, what I thought was interesting about it was using MSNBC's airwaves to announce the business of National Action Network was quite interesting. And once he chooses companies to boycott, should he use MSNBC's airwaves to go after them? That could become really interesting.
Yeah. What if NBC Universal opts to eliminate a program that meets Al Sharpton's definition of DEI? Will he protest them? I don't know. On the other side of the split screen, you have Donald Trump gave his first Oval Office interview to none other than Sean Hannity. And
2 parts. We get more tonight.
Stay tuned. And it was not surprising that Trump would give that interview to Sean Hannity. It was not surprising that it was a fawning interview. The interesting part to me is how the framing of it around the idea. Here's the Fox headline: Trump reflects on return to White House after 4 years of Biden's agenda. Got there just in the nick of time. And if it's a crisis at MSNBC, right, for Black Americans, we've just finished a campaign which, for Republicans, we were in a crisis. This is a crisis. Everything is a crisis. It's the worst thing that's ever happened. It's a disaster. America almost fell. Had Kamala Harris won the election, it was almost over. And it's despicable kind of thinking because, of course, it excuses bad behavior in leaders who are dealing. Donald Trump declared an emergency. And I think, and I highly recommend George Will's piece this week, one of his pieces this week at the Washington Post, Neither Euphoric Nor Despairing Be, Trump too shall pass. And he points out that this is the 49th concurrent emergency in the federal government currently, something like that. And we're addicted to crisis thinking. And when we are addicted to crisis thinking, it prevents us from acting reasonably and rationally and dealing with long-term problems. And it also prevents us from holding ourselves to account because we say, oh, well, it was a crisis.
Well, Chris, you yourself asked whether Trump is poised to invest his political capital or to spend it. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Only to say that I wrote another example of a piece I wrote, and I was on deadline. I was writing it on Inauguration Day. And I was like, I didn't quite get there. It was okay, but I didn't quite get there. And I have this experience with George Will a lot, Kevin Williamson, Jonah, many others. Brother Continetti has a gift for this also, which is you're like, oh, that's what I meant to write. That's what I meant to write. But I do include it because it was my first column at the Hill. I wrote a Tuesday column for the Dispatch for 4 years. And now I'm writing at the Hill. And there's more hashtag content to come at the Hill. And I'm now the political editor at the Hill in addition to News Nation, and enjoying it's an interesting experience to the Dispatch. And I will still be writing periodically for the Dispatch, but the Dispatch audience is wonderful. It's erudite, thoughtful, and very, to use the term, elite, right? People are paying, they're interested in this kind of stuff. You throw it out. The Hill has enormous amounts of web traffic, like enormous amounts of web traffic. And it was an interesting thought to be back out in a broader audience. And it'll be interesting to see how it shapes my thinking and my writing as you think, because when you're writing, you're thinking about what you want to say, but you're thinking about who you're saying it to. So I'm excited for a new adventure.
That's exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you. And I'm very excited to be working with Bill Salmon, my old boss at Fox, again, who is leading the reboot for The Hill, and I'm digging it.
All right. Well, speaking of what you meant to write, we have George Will.
I already plugged it. I've plugged it. I've said what I need to say about George Will, which is that was the perfect inauguration week column. George Will,
can you
undefeated.
just can you give a summary?
Don't live in one side of the split screen, right? It's not going to be as good as you think. It's not going to be as bad as you think. It's not going to be what you think. Some things are predictable. Donald Trump pardoning the January 6th offenders, predictable. A little bit bigger and broader than I think many of his supporters / apologists would have said. But it was a predictable thing that would happen. He had said that he was going to do it. What's the arc of all this? How does this all go? You don't know. Nobody knows. So watch and wait and be cool, and don't live in either Sean Hannity's universe or Al Sharpton's universe.
Chris, Bloomberg had a really interesting piece. The headline was "The Second Trump Presidency Brought to You by YouTubers." And it was about the influential YouTubers and podcasters who played an important role in elevating Trump to the presidency, because he's a talker and he was able to exploit the opportunities that they presented. And it's sort of a piece with, over the weekend, I went to a dinner hosted by Spotify, and there was a debate there about whether, print news is dead and everybody's getting their news through podcasts and YouTube. And that was really interesting. I'll talk a little bit more about it. But do you want to talk about this piece, or you want me to summarize it?
I found the data fascinating, right? Because they looked at all of the podcasts Trump went on, Trump and Vance went on, who these people are, what their reach is. So from a data perspective, it was very useful to me. The motif of the piece, though, was that these people had become, and so there's a normal part. No, I'll put it this way. New media people are media people. They go where they think the audience is. They suck up to guests to get good bookings. All of those things are true. Does one imagine that, and I don't want to be disdainful of any other Sunday show because it's really tough, but does one think that the hosts of televised chat shows don't ever say, I don't know if we're going to do that topic. I don't know, because we're trying to book so-and-so. So let's not do that. Of course, I'm sure that happens. In the print world, you call it beat sweetening. And sometimes you see a story that's an obvious beat sweetener, right? Oh, we're writing about Jill Biden's initiative for education. That's a beat sweetener, because what you're saying is, hey, look at this nice thing I did for you. I'm not a dangerous person. It's hacky, it's whatever it is, but it's not different when it happens on Joe Rogan's podcast than it is when it happens in traditional media. The number one. Number two, they do make it sound scandalous that they started talking more about these issues as the election got closer, and they have charts that say, oh, look at how much more they were talking about. Well, there was going to be an election. That's why. That's a lot of why. If we could track conversations at diner counters that took place in the United States over the course of 2024, I'm going to guess that politics and political conversations became more prevalent as we moved into the autumn of the year. So the data's good. I'm glad it's there. I studied it. I will continue to look at it. I'm sure it will be useful in the future, but I think they were reaching to make a trend story out of it.
So I want to get into this a little bit more. So the YouTubers and podcasters that they talk about in this piece, who have enormous audiences, they focus on 9, and they are Aiden Ross of Aiden Live, Andrew Schultz of Flagrant, the Nelk Boys of the Full Send podcast, Logan Paul of Impulsive, Joe Rogan of the Joe Rogan Experience, Lex Fridman of the Lex Fridman podcast, Patrick Bet David of PBD podcast, Sean Ryan of the Sean Ryan Show, and Theo Vaughn of This Past Weekend. And several of these guys were seated behind Trump at the inauguration, including Joe Rogan, and were here over the weekend celebrating the inauguration, including the Paul brothers and Lex Fridman, etc. So I was at this dinner with podcasters, several of whom were prominent, some of whom are in this list. And there was a really interesting debate that unfolded that I think is sort of at the heart of this Bloomberg coverage, although it's not written here. And the podcasters, the prominent podcasters and YouTubers are basically center right or right wing, because those are the voices you tend not to hear in the mainstream media, and people are going to seek out those voices elsewhere. It's pretty obvious. However, the debate that unfolded, and this was off the record, so I'm not going to name anybody's names, was, is mainstream, is traditional news media, whether conservative or liberal, whether it comes from Fox News, the New York Post, the New York Times, is that dead? And is the future podcasting and YouTubing? And it was really interesting because it seemed to be the strongly held view of some of these podcasters and YouTubers that simply they are the future of the way people are going to consume information. And I was just really an observer and listener and thought it was really interesting. I wasn't actually privy to that view. And it just sort of struck me, my own personal view was like, these things are really apples and oranges. You know, one thing that most of these YouTubers and podcasters don't do is reporting to actually produce the news. Again, whether it's from a conservative perspective or a mainstream perspective, which is quite expensive and costs money. Now, some of them do interviews, which are themselves news producing, but again, not quite the same as you spend 2 weeks on a story and write it. And then that's content that much of these guys go talk about. And so it was interesting. And to me, like, I just look at them as completely different products. But that does seem to be at the heart of some of these debates, separate and apart from the ideological debate, which is there's some hostility to these guys because, the mainstream is ideologically hostile to them.
Very much agree. And it's of a piece with the criticism that I was criticizing. You're too young, but there was a time in the early aughts where it was going to be blogs, right? It's all about blogs. And then it was going to be all about Substack, and it's going to be all about podcasts, and it's going to be all about this, and it's going to be all about that. It won't be. It won't be. It has never mattered less what platform you're on. It's Joe Rogan has a show.
And now it's like all about newsletters. It's all about newsletters and podcasting and YouTube. But it's really like, what is the form that you're getting the new information from, and what is the form that you're getting commentary and opinion from?
Joe Rogan is different from Johnny Carson and Dick Cavett. It's a very different format from Johnny Carson and Dick Cavett. No doubt. He's got a lot more time and whatever, but it's the same thing. It's a chat show. We're having people come on, and sometimes we're goofing, and sometimes we're talking about kind of serious things, and I have a personality, da 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 da. It's not a different thing. It's entertainment. It's a place where news and entertainment meet, and that's not new. And the idea that it will all be this or it will all be that, platform just, I don't think matters nearly as much as people think. I certainly think that for people of our children's vintage, the idea that, was that on YouTube or was that on Tubi, right? I don't think it will matter very much at all where people watch or listen to things. I think Apple and Spotify and other podcast providers are going to continue to battle in this space, but I'm not impressed that this is a brand new kind of thing or something that is a radical departure from where it's been before. I don't know whether or not Ronald Reagan invited Johnny Carson or somebody to be at his inauguration. I don't know. I'm sure we could go back and do analysis to find influential media people who were invited to previous presidential inaugurations, but I don't know. I'm much less inclined to see this as a dramatic difference than another transmogrification of the multi-headed media hydra.
The other thing that came out that was interesting and I hadn't really thought through was a few of these guys talked about the importance of the length of their interviews in terms of sussing out like key and newsworthy moments, and just that they will not do interviews for 45 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever many of these high profile guests want, which is the bread and butter of the cable news model. It's like a 5-minute hit here or a 30-minute sit down with Kamala Harris. And they view having 2 or 3 hours as hugely important, partly because it's hard to lie for that long. And they spend, an hour shooting the blank and getting the person comfortable. And I just hadn't paid attention to that. And it was really interesting to hear some of these guys talk about the enormous importance they put on having such a long time with guests in terms of getting important information out of them.
Yeah, well, let's put it this way. In earlier parts of our career, part of the reason that Wretches is a delightful experience, where were we going to do this? Right? Were we going to have a radio show? Was somebody going to give us an hour and 20 minutes a week to shoot the breeze over what's going on in the news media? No, it's cool. And that's the banishment of physical limits on content is a curse in many ways. It makes a lot of writing bad. It makes a lot of content bad and overlong because we were helped. That's speaking of writing at the Hill. When you're writing, there's a print product for the Hill. And when you're writing for print, it was quite an adjustment because instead of, when you're writing for digital only, how long do you want it? About 1,000 words. It's okay. If it's 1,100 or if it's 950. But if the news hole is 975 words, you better come in at 975 words. There are advantages to those limitations, but the abolition of space has given us a lot of gifts.
Let's talk about what the Trump administration has actually done in 3 days. We're recording Thursday morning, so it's been, Monday evening plus a full day Tuesday and Wednesday. And there's been a mad flurry of executive orders. And it was pretty clear, Chris, that they spent the past 2 months or 2.5 months since their victory in November doing pretty careful, meticulous preparation. I covered the last Trump administration at Politico, and the first EO that came out was the Muslim ban, which had to go back to the drawing board, was totally rewritten, struck down in court. That does not appear. The birthright immigration ban will be challenged in court, but there are hundreds of these things coming down, and most of them seem pretty carefully done.
Well, I assume that the reinterpretation of the 14th Amendment was that they expected that it would be fought, right? They expected that would be subsumed by legal dispute, as obviously it should be. That's a bold statement to say that you imagine what it is to be a citizen differently.
For sure. And that seems to me like they know that would be challenged. They're prepared for that challenge. It's a different thing than the sloppily done Muslim ban of the first administration. And you flagged in terms of media stuff over at the Federal Communications Commission, chaired by Brendan Carr. New FCC chair revives complaints about ABC, CBS, and NBC content that his predecessor rejected as, quote, at odds with the First Amendment. Why don't you dive into this? I have to say, I really don't know enough about the complaints or the revival of them to have much of a view on this.
This does not strike me as something that was carefully thought out and ingenious. This strikes me as, equal time is a concept that belonged to an era where the people thought of the airwaves as government property. They were limited in space. There were limited outlets, and equal time from the FCC was about, well, if you're using the public airwaves to promote one candidate, you have to use the public airwaves to give equal time to the other side. I don't think that's relevant in any real way anymore. We're just talking about how many listeners does Joe Rogan have? Tens of millions. A massive number. The idea. So this one is a complaint filed against WNBC in New York for its putting Kamala Harris on Saturday Night Live, airing the parent company's episode with Kamala Harris, and another one against ABC News. Against ABC News for the way they hosted the presidential debate in the person of WPVI television, and against WCBS for news distortion because of a 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris. And this is just trash. If we don't know that 60 Minutes is left leaning, I hate to break it to you. If you have not heard that CBS News and 60 Minutes are left leaning products, and the idea that we're going to have the federal government inquire as to the political leanings of CBS News, or that the federal government's going to inquire about these things, and that the new FCC, newly redrawn FCC, is saying to news organizations, well, you better be careful. You better be careful because your licenses could be in trouble if you don't do it the way that we like it. And even if we don't fine you, even if we don't punish you, you're going to have to deal with it. You're going to have to spend money on it. You're going to have to be around, is jawboning of the worst kind. And whatever you think about the previous FCC, net neutrality or a host of other issues that the FCC tried an overly broad government stance relating to the media about, they were right about that. That is not appropriate under the First Amendment to have the state say, I don't know if I like the way you did that interview. You may suffer financial costs for the political bias you have. So that's a boo.
Up next, this relates to one of Trump's executive orders designating Mexican cartels and other criminal organizations, as foreign terrorists. And the New York Times has a piece, How Labeling Cartels Terrorists Could Hurt the U.S. Economy. And they write, isolating U.S. companies from cartel activities could be almost impossible, given that the criminal groups operate in sectors like agriculture and tourism, leaving some American businesses vulnerable to sanctions. And the upshot of the piece was, it's just impossible for American businesses not to be entangled with Mexican cartel activities. And, what are they going to do? What are they going to do?
This is the other side of that coin. There will be consequence. So the describing the cartels as terrorist organizations has some important implications that this piece points to about what the financial and other actions that can be taken. Can you seize assets? Can you take away the possessions of? What can you do, and what can you do? And if you think of it this way, if you're part of a American gang and you're a distributor for a foreign cartel, you may be content that some of your lieutenants and dealers will end up serving prison terms. That comes with the territory. But if all of a sudden you're like, oh, I got the Treasury Department where this gets bigger, this gets broader, this gets more challenging, then there are implications there. And that's what that is. There are also implications for Mexico. I mean, it will be complicated. It will be hard. It will be costly. It's true what the New York Times says, that I expect it will be costly because of the power that the cartels have in Latin America. Yes. But either you want to get tough on drug trafficking and the cartels, or you do not want to get tough with drug trafficking and the cartels. So this was like, I mean, come on.
Chris, I just had to send this because Fox News has a history of amusing typos in its lower thirds, where, what's a good way to describe a lower third?
It's the banner that goes across the lower third of the screen that tells you who the person is or what they're talking about.
So my favorite was Elie Wiesel. The late Elie Wiesel was on once, and they described him as a Holocaust winner, Elie Wiesel, instead of Holocaust survivor. So my husband saw this. It was going on Twitter. They instead of TikTok, they had TITKOK.
Oh dear.
Shuts down in the U.S. Titcock shuts down in the U.S.
Oh dear.
And we were laughing about that.
Oh, most unfortunate. Most unfortunate.
We will include the screenshot in our newsletter. Chris, I just wanted to touch on this Biden thing because part of the split screen that we're seeing that was just driving me crazy. So Biden pardoned his family, which was gross, issued these preemptive pardons for his family 20 minutes before he left office. Everybody was already in the Capitol Rotunda for the Trump ceremony. But then the entire mainstream media has been focused on the January 6th pardons. And how could he pardon people who committed violent acts against law enforcement officials? And every Republican who's gone on CNN or MSNBC has been asked this. And I've watched the debates. And unmentioned on these networks is that Biden also pardoned Leonard Peltier, who murdered FBI agents.
He sure did.
And they don't say, like, both of these guys pardoned people who committed violent acts against law enforcement officials, and murdering FBI agents is worse than whatever these guys did to police officers at the Capitol, which was bad, and they're both bad. But it's amazing to me how there's just no talk on the cables about the Peltier pardon. But then I read in the Washington Post and the New York Times, and it's funny, I actually had flagged a Washington Post piece in here, and then the headline had been changed since a couple days ago. When you read about the Peltier pardon in the Times or the Post, he was described as a Native American rights activist, convicted in FBI killings or who murdered FBI agents. But the first descriptor of him was Native American rights activist. And when I clicked on the Post link today, the headline was changed. However, the New York Times still has Biden commutes prison sentence of Leonard Peltier, an indigenous rights activist convicted in FBI killings. So, you know, his core identity is indigenous rights activist. He happened to have been convicted in these FBI killings. And then the write-up of the piece is that Biden used his final minutes of presidential power on Monday to free a man who has spent nearly 50 years in federal prison after he was convicted of murder in connection with the killing of 2 FBI agents. Supporters of Mr. Peltier, who include tribal leaders, lawmakers, and global figures, have long pushed for his release, arguing that he was unjustly convicted after an unfair trial. But former and current FBI officials, including Christopher Wray, the agency director, resisted the commutation as a betrayal of the dead officers.
If we called the attackers of January 6th, if we called them
white rights activists,
well, what if we called them election integrity activists?
Yeah.
what if voter identification activists? Obviously what Trump did is bigger and, by my lights, worse, both in volume and in the fact that it is an incitement to an encouragement to more bad things in the future, and all of that stuff. And Peltier is just one guy. But yes, the way that, do you remember Mumia?
Oh yeah.
I forget which college had Mumia, who I feel confident was convicted, I believe, of killing a police officer.
Yeah, he was convicted in the murder of a Philadelphia police officer.
And that Mumia, who became a social justice icon and all of this stuff. And Leonard Peltier was of a piece with this. And this is the thing about political violence. It must be deeply punished, sharply punished. It must be unacceptable even among those who agree with the ambitions of the people. And the Peltier pardon, you know, I've said many unkind things about Joe Biden and the end of his term, but the pardons of the people who committed no crimes on the January 6th committee, the pardons of his family, had an orgiastic quality of a desperate effort for relevance and a too much love of the presidential power. And I listened to David Axelrod talk about it. And I think for Biden, he got a long time. Oh, and by the way, the New York Times truing up the books at the end on Biden's infirmity. Pieces like, well, actually, and some of it is bias, but other parts of it, I'm sympathetic to why they only came out at the end, which is the people in the White House weren't going to talk about it before. And now more people, since it's all over, were ready to say, yeah, it was pretty bad.
Well, okay, maybe, but I still thought the Times piece that they did on Biden's infirmity was totally insufficient, and that the focus was totally on his physical limitations and the limitations of his energy as a result of age. And what nobody has dug in on are his serious mental limitations, and does he have a condition?
Yeah.
And that seems to still be a third rail that nobody will touch.
Yeah.
Everything in the Times piece was attributed to, it was like, oh, well, he sprained his foot, or he had a fracture in his foot before he was sworn in, and he never let it fully heal because he didn't want to be seen in a boot at the inauguration. And then he traveled too much, and so he was just so tired, and they shouldn't have had him flying all over the world. But it wasn't like, okay, why did he call out the name of a dead congresswoman? And why did he forget the names of his cabinet secretaries? Like, they still haven't gotten into that.
Yeah. The Wall Street Journal has been way ahead on this one and talking about Biden's inability to hear bad news, to deal with urgent matters as they arose, and all of that stuff. And I will imagine, though.
Yeah, why did his advisors not tell him that he was going to lose the election to Trump? Why is he still out there saying the polls showed him winning?
Well, that one, Donald Trump didn't even believe that the arrogance of many politicians is so great that whatever their age, they can never believe that they would lose. But the Afghan withdrawal and Biden not being able to hear counsel on it and being petulant about it and being basically unable to execute his duties, and not because he has a fracture in his foot, but because he's not cogent or not emotionally stable enough to hear the news. We'll hear a lot about Donald Trump's emotional instability because we heard a lot about it last time, and I have no reason to think that he is more emotionally mature now than he was 8 years ago. But we should be hearing a lot more about the ways in which Joe Biden's mental state was harmful. And I bet that as books come out, right, I bet as the story is told, there's going to be a lot of it. There's going to be a lot of it.
You think there will be?
Yeah.
I talked to some folks over the weekend, like, who's going to talk? Because it's such an indictment of their own role. Like, the people who would know and be able to really shed light on what happened in the Biden White House, like, it would be a real indictment of the role that they played.
What will happen now is the score settling, and there will be attack and counterattack, and we don't yet know what role Kamala Harris sees for herself. And her faction is small, but it's bigger than Joe Biden's faction. And there will be scores to be settled there, and there will be scores to be settled as Democrats start positioning themselves for the next presidential election. And fealty to Biden will be seen as a disadvantage in this space. And there will also be tit for tat, retributive leaking. Somebody will have a story that says so-and-so knew and did this, and they'll say, oh, well, how about that so-and-so knew that and did this? And I believe that the unstable truce that settled over the Democratic Party for the second half of 2024, the Democrats are getting ready to pick a DNC chairperson, and it will be an opening skirmish in what I expect will be a pretty rough and tough battle among Democrats to assign blame and to figure out what they're going to do next.
All right, Chris, that brings us to the media business portion of our show before we get to our obsessions. And today, CNN is laying off hundreds of employees as Trump-era restructuring begins. Mediaite reported, and that is of a piece with the CNN CEO Mark Thompson's message to on-air talent.
Oh.
He told them not to express outrage during Trump's inaugural coverage. And I read yesterday, I can't remember where now, but that if you go back to the 2020 inaugural, 2016 inaugural, and you watch some of the CNN hosts and their commentary during those ceremonies, and then contrast it with 2024, where they had to zip it, it's like, completely different people. It's the same people, but different personality implants because they couldn't air their opinions. Anyhow, CNN's laying off about 200 people today. I think that's 8%. It's under 10% of their workforce. However, they're also announcing new job openings in the digital realm. And they're going to move a lot of jobs and production of shows to Atlanta, where the cost of production is cheaper. And there are also layoffs coming to NBC, although not as many, and ABC. And this is just of a piece with the decline of cable news and the shift to digital. I mean, I don't know, Chris.
We're hanging on. We're
Yeah.
hanging on. This is framed as Trump era restructuring, that CNN is restructuring for the Trump era. This is also what happens when you staff up for a presidential election and then the presidential election is over and the amount of viewership and interest goes down. What I'm going to be interested to see is
okay, yeah, but like Fox News isn't firing 200 people.
Well, Fox News doesn't hire as many. Fox News does it famously cheap, and these other organizations staff way up and then they fire a bunch of people. And there are advantages and disadvantages, but Donald Trump was a revenue machine for media outlets, pro and con. In the first go around, I'm going to be very interested to see, is he a ratings? Have you seen what the inauguration ratings were? I have not looked.
I just saw that Fox had about 10 times. I just remember the proportions. Fox had 10 times the ratings of CNN.
Well, I definitely believe that because I don't think CNN's audience was eager to tune in for Trump's inauguration. That goes into the when your football team loses, you don't watch SportsCenter the next day. I get that. There's that. But I wonder what overall viewership was like. I should have done my research before I got here.
And Chris, the other media news was Prince Harry's settlement with Rupert Murdoch's group newspapers in the UK. So he was set to go to court with them. And there was a lot of chit chat in the US that former Murdoch employee executive Will Lewis, who is now the publisher of the Washington Post, was going to have to testify about his role in some of this. But now they have settled. So Murdoch's group newspapers acknowledged serious intrusion into Harry's private life. This is from the Washington Post, including incidents of unlawful activities carried out by private investigators working for Murdoch's Sun tabloid, and phone hacking, surveillance, and misuse of private information by journalists and private investigators working for the shuttered News of the World, according to the statement, which was read in court by Harry's lawyer, David Sherborne. An executive summary of the claimant's arguments indicated that Harry and the Murdoch legal team, Harry's legal teams plan to allege that over 30 million emails were deliberately destroyed as part of a scheme to keep evidence from police investigators. And the document asserted that a pivotal role in directing the email deletions had been played by Rebecca Brooks, the former Sun editor and still a senior executive for Murdoch, and former News International general manager Will Lewis, now publisher and CEO of the Washington Post.
When this suit was live, Harry, and by the way, does Meghan Markle have a cooking show now? Did I see that?
I don't know. I have to admit, I don't follow her much.
I think I saw that. But okay, so she had a cooking show on Netflix that was delayed as she aims to be, I guess, Gwyneth Paltrow. I don't know. When this suit was filed and when Harry had rebuffed earlier offers for settlement, he said, no, this is about principle because he did not, as it is revealed now, there was a number, right? There was a number at which his quiescence could be bought, and everybody's got a number, even former royal adjacent former princes, and it was that was the legal budget at Fox at News Corp is big, and I bet this was a big payout.
I bet it was a huge payout, and especially because Harry's cut off from the royal family now, I'm sure he was happy to take 8 figures and walk
now
away.
We don't have to, I hope, hear or think about he and his wife as arbiters of what is decent and moral. They took, and no hate, right? But if you say, I'll never settle, this is about the principle, and then you say, well, as it turns out, there was a number.
There's always a number.
There's always a number.
Chris, that brings us to our obsessions of the week, where we break down the stories we can't get out of our heads. And Chris, my obsession is the new allegation against Pete Hegseth, unearthed by NBC News in the form of a sworn affidavit signed by his former sister-in-law. So it took me a while to figure out how this woman was his sister-in-law, because she's no longer actually a part of the Hegseth family. So she was married, this woman, Danielle Hegseth, was married to Pete's brother. And the allegation by her is of heavy drinking and instances of abuse or threats of abuse against Hegseth's ex-wife, and this is his second wife, Samantha Hegseth. And it's a complicated story because the ex-wife, Samantha Hegseth, went on the record saying that there was no physical abuse in her marriage and that she did not want to talk to the press. So she replied, "There was no physical abuse in my marriage. This is the only further statement I will make to you. I have let you know that I am not speaking and will not speak on my marriage to Pete. Please respect this decision." And what I thought was interesting about this was that the lead of all the pieces was about the allegation, and then buried several paragraphs down and sometimes not mentioned at all, though in the case of the NBC News piece that broke the story, it's buried about 6 paragraphs down, is the on the record denial from the ex-wife. And I thought about this for a while, and I think while I do think that the affidavit is newsworthy, you kind of have to put right after it that the ex-wife denies it all.
Yeah.
And that also seems like it should have to be in the headline.
I mean, whether it's in the headline or not, it should be in the lead or very high up, right? That's like the second sentence.
Because it's pretty important that the subject of this and the witness, the person who would have witnessed any of this stuff firsthand, says no.
I did not, and if I have missed something, I apologize. But if you were already okay with Pete Hegseth being the Secretary of Defense, I did not see the thing in this that made you say, well, in that case, because whatever Pete Hegseth's second marriage was like, he's come to terms with the mother of his children about what they're going to say about each other. And he's got his story, and he seemed Lisa Murkowski, there's, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, other Republican senators who had misgivings about Hegseth, who, and I say this in a clinical kind of way, who is not qualified to be the Secretary of Defense. He's qualified in the sense that he meets the criteria for the job. And you may think that he's perfect, right? You may think that he is the perfect choice, but he's not, to say the least. He is not the typical kind of person who is chosen to lead a large and complex organization. So
the amazing thing is that the New York Times covers this story, and they don't even mention the ex-wife's denial. They say their headline is Hegseth ex-sister-in-law tells senators he was, quote, abusive to second wife. A woman once married to the brother of Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary nominee, submitted a sworn statement to the Senate in a late hour complication to his confirmation. His lawyer denied her account. Okay. An ex-sister-in-law of Pete Hegseth submitted a sworn affidavit to senators on Tuesday that accused Mr. Hegseth, President Trump's nominee for Secretary of Defense, of being so, quote, abusive toward his second wife that she once hid in a closet from him and had a safe word to call for help if she needed to get away from him. And they just don't mention that the ex-wife denied this in a statement to NBC News.
That seems a rather glaring
Yeah.
omission. But for me, if you were there and ready to back Pete Hegseth before this came out, I don't know what would have changed, especially as you say, if the wife is sticking with the story, right? So I'm the amount of attention that's been paid to this affidavit, which to my understanding doesn't change anything. And again, I may be missing something here. And there are complaints about how the FBI background check was done, and there's all of this stuff. But if you were a person who was ready to back Pete Hegseth on Monday, I don't know what on Tuesday was different.
Sorry, the Times does mention, they give one line to the denials. It is 17 paragraphs down.
Believe
I
women.
found it. I found it. Okay. Chris, what is your obsession?
Well, my obsession is Delta Airlines. No, this is flagged by my eldest man-child. A lot of family members doing the heavy lifting of Wretch excellence this week. And the Wall Street Journal is out with its ratings of the best and worst airlines. And well, first of all, let me ask you, what's your airline?
My airline is American, but it's not necessarily because it's my favorite. It's just because the hub is in right here.
Well, yeah, if you're in Washington, if you want to fly out of Reagan,
Yeah.
American has the edge. But which airline do you most enjoy flying on?
I really only fly American.
You never have to fly
It's
anybody
not
else?
never, but it's just I'm not paying close attention because 85% of the flights I fly, of course I like, Etihad when I fly Etihad, but it's not often.
So you're just going to evade the question. You're not.
Yeah, because
you're
I
not
don't
going
have
to
an
engage
informed
with this
view.
question.
I don't have an informed enough view.
So I'm going to put you down as Etihad as your
Sure.
as your best.
But I wish I had flown enough of these guys. Well, of the ones in this little
The grid,
I guess I like Delta.
Delta. The rankings go: Delta, Southwest, Alaska, Allegiant, United, JetBlue, American, Spirit, and Frontier. And based on on-time arrivals, the number of canceled flights, or as the percentage of canceled flight, Delta finished first in on-time arrivals and was the only airline in the ranking to exceed 80%, though it was down from 83% in 2023. It canceled far fewer flights than in 2023, giving it the lowest cancellation rate besides Southwest. This year, it ranked fifth in that category. Delta's weak spot, bag handling, the airline's mishandled bag rate, trailed those of Allegiant, JetBlue, Frontier, and Southwest. I don't know if I appreciate the vibe that Delta is giving off is that they're the fun big airline. They wear purple. They're trying to have more fun. It seems like I love, and I know that this puts me in the minority. I love American Airlines. I find them to be good to deal with. I find them to be businesslike. You know what I feel like? I feel like American is the dad airline. I feel like American Airlines, and I have a long association with American Airlines because Pittsburgh, which was the closest airport growing up, was served by first Piedmont Airlines and then US Air, and then US Air became part of American. So maybe it's just I'm in, but I think I fly I'll be flying Delta next month, and I'll miss American Airlines when I'm on Delta. So I feel bad for anybody who has had bad experiences, but I gotta say, I'm in. Maybe it's that it's named American. Maybe I just like America that much.
Okay.
And
I like
by the way,
American too.
by the way, Southwest Airlines is a nightmare. People who are enthusiasts for Southwest, including the young adult who sent me this content, I can't get there. The chaos of trying to board with in this like Altamont energy is beneath the dignity of decent business travelers.
All right, Chris, that brings us to my favorite time of the week. I feel like you're going to love this question. Reader mail. We have a note from Bob Legg in Hoover, Alabama.
Hi, Bob.
And Bob writes, "Hi, I saw the retraction by the woman who had accused the Duke lacrosse team of rape a couple of weeks ago. So this was the retraction a couple weeks ago about that 2005 or 6 accusation, and went back and read some of the New York Times editorials during that time and wondered how the Times had avoided being sued for defamation. With the recent judgment against CNN for defamation, I was further confused over what the rules really are for defamation by a wretch and whether they are changing. Can you briefly discuss the changing role of defamation in the American media? Thank you very much."
You want to go first?
Sure. So the opinion is protected. And that is what Fox News tried to argue when it was fighting the Dominion defamation lawsuit, that when its anchors, reporters, and then primetime hosts were making claims about the integrity of the 2020 election, it was just their opinion. And that was controversial because they were essentially saying people shouldn't take this stuff seriously. It's not news. With news, the standard is you can make mistakes, but you have to retract and apologize for them. And the standard for mistakes is that they have to have been made with actual malice or, gross negligence in the process, meaning that those are things like you didn't reach out for comment, you didn't print the person's comment in there. In the case of CNN, they gave the guy 2 hours to reply, and he had told them, "This stuff isn't true, and I'm going to sue you if you print it." So they had been warned, and all these chats came out in the trial of them saying, "Oh, he's a total a-hole. We're going to take him down. He's got a punchable face." So there, and then I covered a bit of the Duke lacrosse case in one of my first reporting jobs, and there were a lot of complicating factors in that the prosecutor in the case, Nifong, was actually disbarred. And so in the end.
Yeah.
So if you'd been covering it and not been paying super close attention, and again, I don't remember the sort of exact things, I think it was a hard and complicated case to cover. I did see that the New York Times did a big, at the time, their public editor did a big piece about the nature of the Times' news coverage. Again, not their editorials, which would have been exempt from all this because that's just the Times' opinion. And everybody knows that when they're reading it, and faulted them for giving too much weight to certain statements from prosecutors, certain evidence from the prosecutors. And so that was interesting to read, but I can see why it wasn't defamatory, in that those aren't things that may have been done with actual malice.
The governing case is, I want to say 1965 or so, case Sullivan versus New York Times, which was a lawsuit that was filed by a sheriff, a police chief, somebody, against New York Times, which ran an ad that was purchased by supporters of Martin Luther King, which made untrue claims about the treatment of Martin Luther King. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said it's a malice. The standard is actual malice. You have to, so first we should say public figures are treated differently. You can say almost anything that you want about a person who has chosen to put themselves in the public debate. And what the Sullivan case, though, fleshed out was, if you're wrong, you have to be knowingly wrong or maliciously wrong. And so if you're negligent, it has to be reckless negligence, right? You have to say, I don't even want it. You can't say, okay, you got 2 hours to say no. And the way that you do it has to be reckless. And this has been the standard. We were, for a long time, didn't get very many. I mean, I've been in playing different roles in multiple libel kinds of lawsuits. I've been deposed. I've been named in suits. I've been a witness in suits. So it's not brand new, but we are certainly in a new frontier here where people are testing these limits, and Supreme Court justices, including Clarence Thomas, have signaled an openness to the idea of reconsidering the Sullivan standards and whether those are okay. So I would imagine that Disney paying off Donald Trump's lawsuit, I would imagine that CNN's defeat in the case that you just described, and others will invite more lawsuits and eventually new precedents around this stuff.
Chris, that brings us to your favorite time of the week, where I am forced to say something nice. But you go first.
Well, keeping the family business theme afloat, this was sent to me by my betrothed, the great Jessica Malugin, and she knew her audience. So there's a great X account, which is just the news of the day from this day 100 years ago. And it used to be 1924, and then now it's 1925. And I love the account. It's a bracing and useful historical frame check on things. I want to get the name right. It's at 100 years ago live. And here's the headline in the Washington Times for the eve of the Coolidge inauguration. Coolidge forbids big inauguration. He demands that his upcoming inauguration be simple and spendthrift. His inaugural committee wanted to throw an opulent party, but Silent Cal demands a small ceremony. And every time I think I couldn't love Calvin Coolidge more, I find a way. And it's a great account, and it's a great reminder that this is mostly garbage and unbecoming to what should be a solemn investiture that has been turned into an orgy of celebrity goofiness.
Chris, I gotta say, we gotta end with inaugural fashion too. Lauren Sanchez, who is the fiance of Jeff Bezos, wore this piece of lingerie to the Capitol Rotunda.
Quite a garment.
Showed off her assets there and got a lot of attention. And my favorite items were the coverage of Lauren Sanchez's outfit. So I'm almost happy she wore it because the coverage was so enjoyable. And I did the Megyn Kelly show on Monday, the day of the inauguration, where she went on a tirade against Sanchez, but there was so much good coverage. My favorite influencer, Bethany Frankel, was on Instagram defending Lauren Sanchez, saying, she's dating Jeff Bezos. She can wear whatever the heck she wants. So I just loved all this coverage. And if you like following this stuff, enjoy.
And please to enjoy.
That is all the time we have for the news about the news. If you have a story you want us to talk about, email us at wretches@nebulouspodcasts.com and sign up for our newsletter at nebulouspodcasts.com. This has been Ink-Stained Wretches from Nebulous Media, produced by Colin Chicola. Find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Wretches.